Welcome back, everybody, for those of you who are joining us again, and for those of you who are joining us for the first time, welcome to A People of Hope. I'm Steve Millies, the director of the Bernardin Center at Catholic Theological Union, coming to you from my home on the south side of Chicago, together with Peter Cunningham, our associate director, and our speaker tonight, Father Dan Horan, whom I will introduce in just a moment. This is the fourth time that we have brought this program to audiences that we hope can be served by an opportunity to come together, not just for an opportunity to reflect over something interesting about this time that we're living through, but also I think the most important part about this is that it's a ministry of presence that we can have to one another at a time when we are all spending just a little too much time in our homes and with our nearest and dearest. Before we get underway, I do just want to let you know a little bit about what we've been doing and what's coming up. So bear with me while I share my screen with you here. If you take a look here, you will see the website, ctu.edu, A People of Hope. You can find it by going to the CTU website, ctu.edu, and you can see tonight's program advertised there. Next week, we'll have another member of our faculty, Sister Lori Brink, talking about a book that she's written about friendship. I think, with due respect to Dan Horan, my favorite title so far in our series, What's 6 Feet Between Friends? That'll be Sister Lori Brink next week. If you go down here a little bit further, you can watch the programs that we've had up to this point, and those programs like this one have been recorded. Some of them also have handouts and other resources. If you click here on subscribe with CTU, that's going to take you over to this page, which will give you some opportunities to engage with CTU in different ways, to receive our Sunday Scripture reflections, to receive our newsletter that comes out twice a year, I believe, to access other programming on Learn at CTU, join us on social media, find upcoming events, and here's an opportunity to join our mailing list, what mail that you might get. And finally, I'd be remiss if I didn't point out that there's an opportunity as well here to support CTU if what we're doing is helpful to you. We certainly appreciate that. We're very grateful that you've joined us, and I don't want to take too much more time before I turn it over to our main speaker, who is, I think I can say, a valued member of our faculty and a good friend, Franciscan Friar Dan Horan, who is Assistant Professor of Systematic Theology and Spirituality, an author of several books, and a regular columnist with the National Catholic Reporter. Dan is going to talk to us tonight about the spiritual Thomas Merton in a time of time. So go ahead and begin. Let me just remind everybody, please keep your microphones on mute so that we can all hear Dan pretty clearly. When it's all done, I'll ask you to unmute yourselves if you have questions, but don't speak until I've recognized you. That'll enable us to keep things sort of regular here. This is our largest crowd so far. I see we've passed 300 now. I'm not accustomed to managing a crowd quite this large. We'll see how it goes at Q&A. But Dan, you've brought an awful lot of folks together here tonight. Tell us a little bit, if you would, about the spirituality of Thomas Merton and how it can help us now.
Thank you so much, Steve, and thank you to everybody who is joining us, those who are friends of CTU, those who are new to CTU. We extend a very warm welcome to you. I'm just going to ask Peter Cunningham to share with you for a moment a screenshot of a handout that will be made available. As Steve mentioned, we'll have a recording posted, and you'll have access to this PDF after the fact. It provides the outline for my remarks tonight. And then on the second page, and Peter, if you can scroll down to the second page, you'll see a little bibliography for some further reading and additional resources. So just to let you know that what we do, what we cover this evening is going to be, really just the tip of the iceberg. And I hope that you are intrigued and interested in learning more about Merton and reading some more of his work. But what I'd like to do first is just tell you a quick overview, the quick outline here as you see. I'm going to offer some introductory remarks, a short opening reflection, the text of which I'm going to share, and you can follow along right there on the screen. Then I want to ask and answer two questions. The first is, who was Merton? I'm going to ask if folks could please mute your computers. It's kind of hard to hear, or ask Peter and Steve to just mute everybody, please. Then I'm going to answer the then I'd like to talk about fear in the present pandemic, look at three themes: silence, solitude, and contemplation, and then offer a closing prayer that comes from the Asian Journal of Thomas Merton, and we will then open it up for discussion that Steve and Peter Cunningham from the Bernardin Center will facilitate. But let me begin first with this opening reflection. It comes from a passage in Merton's 1956 book, Thoughts and Solitude. Merton writes, "The desert is the home of despair, and despair now is everywhere. Let us not think that our interior solitude consists in the acceptance of defeat. We cannot escape anything by consenting tacitly to be defeated. Despair is an abyss without bottom. Do not think to close it by consenting to it and trying to forget you have consented. This, then, is our desert, to live facing despair, but not to consent, to trample it down under hope in the cross, to wage war against despair unceasingly. That war is our wilderness. If we wage courageously, we will find Christ at our side. If we cannot face it, we will never find him." And the reason I wanted to begin with this particular passage is because Merton here is reflecting on the appeal of the desert to people of faith over the centuries, especially the early so-called mothers and fathers of the desert. He writes elsewhere that the desert fathers believed that the wilderness had been created as supremely valuable in the eyes of God, precisely because it had no value to humanity. The wasteland was the land that could never be wasted by men and women because it offered them nothing. There was nothing to attract them. There was nothing to exploit. The desert was created simply to be itself, not to be transformed by men and women into something else. In many ways, I believe that we find ourselves right now not in a physical or a literal desert, but a different kind of wilderness today. One that is indeed the home of despair, one in which fear, anxiety, temptation, suffering, uncertainty, confusion, and doubt all dwell. How is it that we are called to respond? What do we do when we find ourselves driven into the desert against our wills in a manner like Jesus was in Mark's gospel when the Spirit drives him out into that wilderness? The aim of my presentation this evening, and again, I thank Steve and Peter of the Bernardin Center at CTU for inviting me to share some reflections with you, is to focus on these questions. It's not to offer a definitive set of responses or a complete how-to manual for spiritual survival in the desert, but rather, I see this as an opportunity to draw on some of the insights and the wisdom of one of the greatest Catholic spiritual writers of the last century, whose primary ministry was split between the life of monastic contemplation and solitude on the one hand, and the work of introducing the broader Christian community to the spiritual insights of that tradition in the modern world. So let me just mention a couple other logistical things before I get into my remarks a bit further. The first is an acknowledgement of Merton's time and place. He died in 1968, as we'll see again in a moment. But because of that, he was very much a man of his time. And a lot of the quotes that I'm going to share with you include gender-exclusive language, where he refers to humanity as mankind or man instead of men and women or humanity, and oftentimes uses a male pronoun to refer to God. At many points, I've tried to kind of offer an inclusive reading of Merton's text, so you'll see that occasionally, but oftentimes it repeats itself so frequently that it can't really be adjusted. So I'm not exactly apologizing for Merton, but I want to call attention to the fact that his sensitivity to gender inclusivity was reflective of the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, and not of our own time. And I hope that isn't offensive to some of our viewers. The other thing I want to say is that, particularly in my next remarks about who was Merton and why should we care, I'm not going to be able to cover everything about him. And when I talk about our themes of fear and silence, solitude, and contemplation, it's just going to be a little taste of the great depth that's available. So I hope that in our discussion time, if you have more questions or specific questions, we could address that in that moment. So first, who was Merton? For those of you joining us who may not know much about him. In an incredible brief way, what I'll say is that he was born in 1915 in France. He was raised in the United States. He was raised in France and England. His mother died when he was 6 years old. His father died when he was 16. And his only sibling, his brother John Paul, died in World War II when Thomas Merton was a young monk. He enters the Abbey of Gethsemane on December 10th, 1941, after studying English literature at Columbia University, earning both his undergrad and master's degree in literature there. While a student, he had what we would call a conversion. He was baptized and entered the Catholic Church, and almost immediately began discerning entrance into religious life. To make a long story short, after teaching literature for 3 semesters at St. Bonaventure University in Western New York, Thomas Merton entered the Trappist order. While a monk in formation, he published his spiritual autobiography, The Seven Story Mountain in 1948, and it became an instant and surprising bestseller. From that point onward, he continued to write, sometimes on themes from his choosing, sometimes under obedience on themes for the Cistercian order. But he wrote for the remaining 27 years of his monastic vocation. During those 27 years as a monk, he died suddenly on December 10th, 1968. He wrote dozens of books, hundreds of articles and reviews, and tens of thousands of letters. He kept a detailed journal about his experience in the monastery, about his own spiritual life and journey, about correspondence and visits that he had with other people, about what he was reading, what he was listening to, and so on. And that journal was published in the 1990s in 7 volumes and is still available today. For the sake of simplicity, his interests or writing focused often in 2 kind of periods. A lot of Merton scholars will, to make things simple, divide 2 decade-long periods. From, let's say, 1948 to 1958, during which time his writings focused mostly on contemplation, solitude, the spiritual life. And he was also very interested, not just in writing for religious professionals, as it were, like monks and nuns, but for lay people as well. He was convinced long before the Second Vatican Council that all the baptized have a vocation, and all the baptized are called to a personal life of prayer and spirituality. From 1958 to 1968, he was still interested, obviously, in this vocation of prayer and of holiness and of solitude and contemplation, but his interest began to expand beyond the life of interior spirituality to more issues in the so-called, quote, world, right? Here he wrote about war, peace, violence, poverty, racial justice, literary developments, the Cold War, Vietnam, and so on. He was a poet, he was an essayist, he was an accomplished artist and photographer. He was a tremendous teacher who held very important responsibilities within the monastery, including for a period of time as the novice master, and then, or slightly before that, as master of clerics, what we would call today the kind of formation director for the seminarians. So that's a very, very brief overview of who was he. Here's a question, though. Why should we care? Why are we dedicating any time today to Thomas Merton? Merton was somebody who was not only a talented author with a gift for making the rich theological and spiritual tradition of Christianity accessible to popular audiences, he was someone whose full humanity was on display in his writings and in his communications. He, like all of us gathered this evening, was both holy and a sinner. He was also someone who could be incredibly generous and at times rather self-centered. He was someone who sought a life of ever-increasing solitude and yet never stopped engaging with the world. He was humble and at times could be arrogant. He was a complex and multifaceted person as much as anybody else was and is. And this comes through in his life story and in his writings. To give one example, in 1968, shortly before his untimely death, Merton had the opportunity to spend a few days with His Holiness the Dalai Lama while visiting India. And some 2 decades after that very brief meeting, the Dalai Lama wrote in his own memoir about this experience with Merton. And the Dalai Lama says, and I quote, "More striking than his outward appearance, which was memorable in itself, was the inner life that he manifested. I could see he was truly a humble and spiritual man. This was the first time I had been struck by such a feeling of spirituality in anyone who professed Christianity. It was Merton who first introduced me to the real meaning of the word Christian. In a nutshell, Thomas Merton was and is, I believe, a very relatable Christian spiritual guide. He does not sugarcoat the challenges that come with striving to live a serious Christian life, nor does he advocate for an interior escapism. He struggles with everything he teaches. In other words, he practiced what he preached. In his time, he was rightly recognized as an important religious and literary figure, and he actually earned a front page obituary in the New York Times in December of 1968, a summary of how the New York Times described Merton read, "He was a Trappist monk who spoke from the world of silence to questing millions who sought God." As one of the most eminent Merton scholars, Dr. Christine Beauchamp of Nazareth College once wrote about Merton's ongoing relevance and appeal, the continued interest in Merton suggests that people want and need to hear what he has to say, sharing the wisdom of one whose heart awakened to the reality of God within him, a God who calls people to justice and to love. Merton touches and moves readers still. He awakens the hearts of readers because he shares the wisdom of an awakened heart. In 2015, when His Holiness Pope Francis visited the United States, he spoke to a special joint session of Congress. And some of you may remember that very important presentation of the Holy Father. And he named Thomas Merton as one of 4 great Christian role models alongside Abraham Lincoln, Martin Luther King Jr., and Dorothy Day. As someone who spent his entire adult life striving toward authenticity, seeking to live out his baptismal vocation in relationship to God and to others and to all of creation, Merton offers us an abundance of contemporary wisdom. And I believe he may offer us some inspiration and guidance for how to live out our faith in this very challenging age. Which brings me to the topic of fear in our present pandemic. Thomas Merton writes famously in his book, New Seeds of Contemplation, that fear is the root of all war. It's the root of all violence. At first glance, this can seem like an unrelated reflection in our age of pandemic. However, the important thing to note is how fear governs our thoughts, actions, motivations, concerns, and the like. Violence, as Merton would note, takes many forms. War looks very different when it's fought on the battlefield between nations, or between neighbors, or between oneself and God. The breaking of relationships, the fracturing of trust, the inability to love are all forms of violence that arise from fear. I think it's important to pause, however, and note that not all fear is the same. I have often thought of this in terms of the helpful distinction between what we might call rational and irrational fear. Rational fear is like that one has of heights, right? Or of snakes, or in our time, of viral contagions. Irrational fear is oftentimes related to what at first seems to be rational fear, such as that of harm to self or loved ones, which in itself is rational, but can be so often taken to such a point that everything and everyone is viewed as a potential threat, a potential aggressor in the zero-sum game built on rules governed by fear. It's when the parts of our mind and our hearts that are attuned, thanks to evolution and to our environment, to be attentive to the signals triggered by things that are otherwise rationally fearful. It's when that gets hijacked by irrational stimuli that trouble begins, that violence results, that relationships then are broken. Merton notes that this fear is actually quite internal to us. It doesn't originate externally in the manner we like to think or that so many people would make us believe. This is why Merton can say so directly that those who claim in a Christian manner to desire peace in the world should, and I quote, "Instead of loving what you think is peace, love other men and women, and love God above all. And instead of hating the people you think are war makers, hate the appetites and disorder in your own soul, which are the causes of war. If you love peace, then hate injustice, hate tyranny, hate greed, but hate these things in yourself, not in another." There's a lot of reason for rational fear at this moment. A part of Merton's prophetic wisdom is a challenge to each of us to discern what is the object of our fear, who is harmed by that fear, how is this fear operating in our lives and in our world. In other words, Merton cautions us to have discernment, not just about the nature of the fear we experience, but also the motivation of our lives. In his book, Thoughts in Solitude, Merton talks about the importance of a spiritual life and that it's not merely an add-on to the rest of our lives as if it were a kind of hobby or some negligible element among others. Merton writes, if you want to have a spiritual life, you must unify your life. A life is either all spiritual or not spiritual at all. No man or woman can serve two masters. Your life is shaped by the end you live for. You are made in the image of what you desire. Now here, Merton is drawing from the spiritual wisdom of St. Augustine and the medieval Franciscan thinkers who carried the Augustinian tradition through the Middle Ages. St. Bonaventure, a Franciscan theologian of the 13th century, who deeply influenced Merton's early spirituality, expressed a similar sentiment that Merton does when he said that we become like that which we love. The questions then that Merton places before us, which is timely in this age of pandemic, rampant with both rational and irrational fear, are what is the end we are living for? And do we really want a spiritual life? Assuming that our collective answer on this conversation this evening is yes, then the three themes I'd like to reflect on with you this evening, drawing on Merton's wisdom and writings, may serve as a source of inspiration and guidance in learning to develop our spirituality and faith lives in a time of coronavirus. So these are the three themes I'd like to talk about now: silence, solitude, and contemplation. In a sense, all three of these themes are deeply intertwined, and therefore they're difficult to treat discreetly. Recognizing the many ways that these themes overlap, I wish to spend just a few moments on each of them, since they recur over and over again in Merton's writings, and I think are helpful as we think about how we develop a spiritual life in this moment. First, silence. In his book, Thoughts in Solitude, Merton opens a chapter with this meditation on God in silence, and I quote, "It is necessary to name him whose silence I share and worship, for in God's silence he also speaks my own name. He alone knows my name, in which I also know his name. For in the instant in which he calls me my son, I am aware of him as my Father. This recognition is in me an act, and in him a person. The act in me is the movement of his person, his spirit, his love within me. When he moves, I move with him, so that it is I also who move. And in my movement, I both waken to know that I am and cry, Abba, Father." For Merton, silence is the necessary condition of the possibility for a sincere relationship with God. In a way echoing the profound theology of the Jesuit theologian Karl Rahner, Merton writes the following: "My life is a listening. God's life is a speaking. My salvation is to hear and respond. For this, my life must be silent. Hence, my silence is my salvation." End quote. Merton regularly wrote and taught about the dangers of an increasingly distracting world and distracted world, the kind of world in which we find ourselves. He was often quick to complain about noisy farm equipment used at the monastery, the sounds of the military-industrial complex at a military base in Kentucky nearby the Abbey of Gethsemane that often launched large airplanes and actually did some bomb testing. He complains about the distractions that face women and men in society who become desensitized to radio and then over time increasingly television, and in our own time, the internet and so forth. The complaints he recorded were not mere rants of a Luddite or an iconoclast, but the concerns of someone who understood that a robust and grounded spiritual life was only made possible by embracing the silence needed to hear the word of God and respond to God's invitation to relationship. Merton understood this necessary silence as existential. It's part of who we actually are at our core. It's not just merely environmental, as in the absence of noise. He wrote in his 1955 book, No Man is an Island, that we go forth to find God in solitude. There we communicate with God alone, without words, without discursive thoughts, in the silence of our whole being. When what we say is meant for no one else but God, it can hardly be said in language. Merton cautions us to leave behind preconceived images, thoughts, ideas, words, and even senses of our own identity that arise from our own fabrication. He writes elsewhere in the same book that those who love their own noise are impatient of everything else. They constantly defile the silence of the forests and the mountains and the sea. They bore through silent nature in every direction with their machines, for fear that the calm world might accuse them of their own emptiness. In ordinary times, this indictment and examination of conscience would already be challenging for many of us. In our present time of mandatory isolation, of quarantine, of restricted movement and forbidden public gatherings, it might seem even cruel of Merton. But Merton's point is still very instructive. While no one can fault the streaming of Netflix or the listening to podcasts or the endless Zoom connections and meetings that we all are sharing these days, the question rises for those who are interested in their spiritual lives: where is the silence? Do we avoid it out of fear? Fear of what? Is it fear of the world's accusation to us, as Merton says, of our own emptiness? Is it fear of what we might discover about ourselves, about God, about one another? Is noise a source of distraction from what is most important, or the unthinking anesthetic that numbs us to what it is we fear we might encounter in the silence? It's important to know that silence for Thomas Merton is never an end in itself. He doesn't advocate for, again, getting rid of all noise at all times to live totally in silence. He does say, however, silence does not exist in our lives merely for its own sake. It is ordered to something else. Silence is the mother of speech. A lifetime of silence is ordered to an ultimate declaration, which can be put into words, a declaration of all we have longed for and lived for. Life and death, words and silence are given us because of Christ. In Christ, we die to the flesh and live to the spirit. In him, we die to illusion and live to truth. We speak to confess him, and we are silent in order to meditate on him and enter deeper into his silence, which is at once the silence of death and of eternal life, the silence of Good Friday and the peace of Easter morning, end quote. The next theme is solitude. If silence is the condition of the possibility for a spiritual life, for sincere prayer and listening to God, then solitude is the context in which that can take place. Most of us find ourselves right now forced into seclusion, a mandated form of isolation that is the right and the just thing to do so that we can protect ourselves and protect one another from the spread of this novel virus. It can be easy and completely understandable to resent our current situation, to grow weary of the feelings of loneliness and boredom and repetition. And yet, those interested in developing their spirituality, growing in their relationship to God in the time of coronavirus, they might take solace in Merton's insistence on the importance of solitude for the spiritual life of all Christians. In his book, No Man is an Island, Merton writes, "We become solitaries not when we realize how alone we are, but when we sense something of the solitude of God. God's solitude isolates us from everything around us, and yet makes us all the more truly brothers and sisters of all things." This is echoed again by Merton later in his book, New Seeds of Contemplation, in which he says, "True solitude is the home of the person. False solitude is the refuge of the individualist. The person is constituted by a uniquely subsisting capacity to love, by a radical ability to care for all beings made by God and loved by God." It's a good point to reflect on. Even if we find ourselves secluded, isolated by ourselves at times, are we individuals or are we persons governed by love? Merton makes a distinction, I think, that's helpful in this time between true and beneficial solitude and just mere loneliness. The key element for him in real solitude is what he calls recollection. He writes, "Recollection is more than a mere turning inward upon ourselves, and it does not necessarily mean the denial or exclusion of exterior things." He says sometimes we are more recollected, quieter, simple and pure, when we see through exterior things and see God in them, when we see God in them, than when we turn away from them to shut them out of our minds. Recollection, he says, should be seen not as an absence, but as a presence. It makes us, first of all, present to ourselves. It makes us present to whatever reality is most significant in the moment of time in which we are living. And it makes us present to God, present to ourselves in God, present to everything else in God. Recollection then might be likened to discernment and attunement. It is not, as Merton rightly notes, just concentration, because somebody can concentrate on themselves or on some other external distraction. He's not saying solitude is about really just focusing, because you can focus in many different tasks, in many different contexts. Recollection, this important factor in solitude, is the directing of the heart and the mind to what is immediately present, that which is closest to us, that which is deliberately brought forward into our consciousness and in the silence. It's a focus on oneself and God and the relationship we share. Recollection is about being present to oneself and to God. Merton writes, "How many there are who have solitude but do not love it, because their solitude is without recollection. It is only loneliness. It does nothing to bring them to themselves. They are alone because in their solitude they are separated from God and from other people and even from themselves." So many of us find ourselves in a kind of solitude or isolation, and we do not love it because of the fear that we have on so many levels, and again, understandably so. Merton is inviting those of us who find ourselves in this moment, in this condition, to reorient ourselves, to take the being alone that we have, that we are encountering now, as a potential opportunity to embrace what he calls real solitude, and doing this in silence and in prayer. I often think that many of us, even without the dire circumstances in which we find ourselves today, many of us never dare to seek solitude because we confuse, solitude for loneliness. And when we do, we forget that we are not actually alone, but for God, we're with God, we're with another, that God is the one who is already drawing near to us, that God is already present to us. It reminds me of what St. Augustine famously said in the 4th century, that God is the one who is closer to us than we are to ourselves. But how quick we are to forget that, how easy it is under the weight of the fear and of the dangers and of our distractions at times to remember that. In what ways then does solitude, real or actual solitude as Merton describes it, appear like a problem to me today? Why am I resistant if I am? Merton writes in his book New Seeds that the need for true solitude is complex and a dangerous thing, but it is a real need. It is all the more real today, he says. Perhaps this time of necessary isolation can be transformed in part into a time of solitude, in which we seek to be present to ourselves and to God, to rest in the silence, and to contemplate, which is the last theme that I'd like to reflect on with you this evening. On the theme of contemplation, Merton explains in his book New Seeds that physical solitude, exterior silence, and real recollection are all morally necessary for anyone who wants to lead a contemplative life. Silence and solitude are, therefore, not ends in themselves, but means to a greater good. In fact, the greatest good, which is communion with God. Merton is very reticent to offer what we might call steps or a program or a kind of how-to manual for how to contemplate. As Dr. Boshin summarizes a letter from Merton to his Muslim friend Abdul Aziz, who asked his friend the Trappist monk how he lived his own contemplative prayer, Merton explained the following: that it is a very simple way of prayer, centered entirely on attention to the presence of God. It does not mean imagining anything or conceiving a precise image of God, but simply adoring God as invisible and infinitely beyond our comprehension, and realizing God as all. Merton's way of prayer is not thinking about anything, but a direct seeking the face of the invisible, which cannot be found unless we become lost in God who is invisible. At the heart of Thomas Merton's teachings on contemplation is the simple message that it is possible to experience God, to awaken to and become aware of God's presence. And in doing so, it is possible to become real and whole, to become truly oneself. One of the things that made Merton so far ahead of his time is the strong belief that this experience of contemplation, of encounter with God within the context of silence and solitude, was not reserved for religious elites alone. You did not have to be ordained or in a religious community, but by virtue of your shared humanity and the grace of baptism, you are called to seek God in this way too. Each of us are. In 1967, Pope Paul VI, now St. Paul VI, solicited Merton's thoughts on contemplation in the world, and in response, Merton wrote the following. He said, "The contemplative life should not be regarded as the exclusive prerogative of those who dwell in monastic walls." He says, "All men and women can seek and find this intimate awareness and awakening, which is a gift of love and a vivifying touch of creative and redemptive power. That power, which raised Christ from the dead, and which we celebrate at this moment, and cleanses us from dead works to serve the living God. It should certainly be emphasized today that prayer is a real source of personal freedom in the midst of a world in which men and women are dominated by massive organizations and rigid institutions, which seek only to exploit them for money and power." Merton concludes his reflection by saying, "Far from being the cause of alienation, real, true religion in spirit is a liberating force that helps humanity and finds itself in God." While Merton avoids any easy process or program for how each person is meant to engage in contemplation, apart from the necessary conditions we've already discussed, he does note that contemplation does not, in fact, begin with us, but is our response to God's originating call. It is a response to a call from Him who has no voice and yet who speaks in everything that is, and who, most of all, speaks in the depths of our own being, for we ourselves are words of His. But we are words that are meant to respond to God, to answer to Him, to echo Him, and even in some way to contain Him and signify Him. Contemplation, Merton says, is this very echo. Contemplation, Merton writes in New Seeds of Contemplation, is the awareness and realization, even in some sense the experience, of what each Christian obscurely believes. It is no longer I that live, but Christ lives in me. One of the effects of contemplation is the encounter not only with our Creator, but also in some way with ourselves. Merton wrote often about the hiddenness of the true self, which some people don't really like, especially in our modern time, because it sounds so oppositional or binary when contrasted with what Merton calls the false or illusory self. But here, I think Merton's naming something that's very, very important for us to think about, especially in our time, especially when we've lost an anchoring and a grounding of our own identity and our own collective sense of self. Merton is merely reaffirming the truth that the great mystics and spiritual teachers of the Christian tradition have conveyed for centuries. Here are a few examples. Francis of Assisi, in his Admonition 19, says that what a person is before God, that they are, and nothing more or less. In other words, who we are in God's eyes is who we really are. The Franciscan theologian John Duns Scotus talked about hakcheitas, a Latin word that signified a principle of individuation, what makes each of us uniquely ourselves. It's absolutely unique. It's the source of our identity. It comes from God. It is known by God. It is who we really are and are called to be. Think about the great Dominican mystic Meister Eckhart, who talked about that hidden point of encounter with God. Or the 19th century poet, Jesuit poet Gerard Manley Hopkins, who talked about our inscape and how Christ plays in 10,000 places. Merton affirms that the only way we can come into contact with our true self, to discover in some small way who it is we are before God, as seen in God's eyes, is through contemplation. That's why it's so important. We discover ourselves in the discovering of God. As Merton writes in his book, New Seeds, it is not we who choose to awaken ourselves, but God who chooses to awaken us. So let me just conclude my reflection, my remarks for this evening with just a couple comments. The main question that I'm left with, and I invite you to reflect on too, is what do these insights about contemplation, about silence, about solitude mean for us today, particularly in the age of global pandemic? In short, I believe they offer us points of reflection to reorient our sense of isolation. Now, I'm not calling for, and Merton would never endorse, a kind of Pollyannish silver lining reading of an international crisis. This is not to diminish the seriousness and the gravity and the pain and the suffering that many people are experiencing in the world. And it is not in any way a diminishment of the true horror of a global pandemic and the fear, the rational fear of contagion that people experience. However, there is an opportunity perhaps, especially for those of us who have the opportunity or ability to find ourselves in solitude, in isolation, in a context in which we would not have otherwise chosen to be. It might give us resources for thinking about how we enter into the solitude we find ourselves already in a new light. This pandemic is, as I like to remind myself and others, not a retreat. It's not a sabbatical. It's not a vacation. It's not a time meant for continuous prayer or reflection. It's not a time where we're, necessarily in our best headspaces or in our best emotional spaces. And yet, every day offers us an opportunity to embrace silence, to seek solitude, and engage in contemplation in some manner. Can we take some time, just a little bit of time each day to pursue that? Perhaps in doing that, or at least in trying a little bit here and there, we might come to find renewal and comfort from God in the face of the challenges and fears we face today. Now, I'd like to close with a prayer that is found in the Asian Journal of Thomas Merton. O God, we are one with you. You have made us one with you. You have taught us that if we are open to one another, you dwell in us. Help us to preserve this openness and to fight for it with all our hearts. Help us to realize that there can be no understanding where there is mutual rejection. O God, in accepting one another wholeheartedly, fully, completely, we accept you, and we thank you, and we adore you, and we love you with our whole being, because our being is in your being. Our spirit is rooted in your spirit. Fill us then with love, and let us be bound together with love as we go our diverse ways, united in this one spirit which makes you present in the world and which makes you witness to the ultimate reality that is love. Love has overcome. Love is victorious. Amen.